Hello, Truth Seekers. Welcome back. So excited to have you today. We're going to go in a little bit different direction. And for those of you who are cynics and skeptics, you may say, well, this is a conspiracy theory. This book is called The Hidden Nazi, The Untold Story of America's Deal with the Devil. And so far, in my first couple chapters of reading it, it reminds me of my wife complaining that the reason she didn't like Breaking Bad was because she doesn't enjoy watching someone spiral from happy, loving family man into the devil, her words, into complete madness and evil. My next guest, Mr. Dean Reuter, has spent decades, and I kid you not, years and decades, I believe, he'll have to confirm this, putting the pieces together to tell us that one of the worst war criminals to ever exist during World War II, one of Hitler's right-hand men, is not only unknown to history, but that his dark deeds, some of them were complicit in some way with the United States, and has some really interesting details to share. So, Dean, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great. Great to be on with you, TJ.
So, I hope you're enjoying your book tour. How come we've never heard of this man, Hans Himmler, correct?
Kammler, yes, Kammler. And that's a great place to start, why we've never heard about him. I can tell you how I heard about him first from one of my colleagues. You'll note there's three people on the cover of the book, Dr. Colm Lowry and Keith Chester. About 12 years ago, and we have combined been working on this book for probably 40 years between the three of us. I've been involved for just over 10 years. But Keith Chester, who I knew in college, approached me about a dozen years ago to draft a collaboration agreement between him and Dr. Colm Lowry so they could share information about this Nazi general, Hans Himmler. They had both stumbled upon him doing research and then wanted to share their research. The reason we've never heard about him, although he was an all-powerful, all-evil Nazi genius who was responsible in large part for the Holocaust and for Germany's secret weapons, is that at the end of the war, he reportedly died. That's conventional history.
In Czechoslovakia, correct? Was it suicide like Hitler, or did he just disappear somehow? How did he die?
It was reportedly suicide. His driver says that this is the very end of the war. So we're talking about May 1945. The German Reich has largely collapsed. There's limited territory they control in southern Germany, Bavaria, and western Czechoslovakia, including Prague. So Hans Himmler goes to Prague. He's at this point in charge of all of Germany's secret weapons. There's a few armaments facilities there, some nuclear research being done there, some exotic weapons research being done there. We think he went there to collect some final records and maybe a personality or two he could turn over to the Americans. And according to his driver, they drove south from Prague. He had a roadside meeting with another Nazi official, and they argued. That other Nazi official left, and then Hans Himmler walked off into the woods to relieve himself and then never returned. So the driver goes, finds his body, dead by cyanide, which leaves, of course, telltale traces, really a signature sort of poison. And his driver buries him in a shallow grave. The problem with the suicide is that no sidearm was returned. His identity discs, which are sort of the German equivalent of today's dog tags, and his paperwork never returned to the closest battle station or Red Cross station. There's never been a body discovered, and a post-war search for a grave turned up empty. And Hans Himmler, I mentioned, was powerful. He's an Obergruppenfuhrer, the only man elevated to the highest rank within the SS in the final year of the war. That's how elite he was. This is equivalent to somebody of the rank of George Patton. So this is like losing the body of George Patton in the field of battle. It's unthinkable. That's why my fellow researchers first started looking at him. They didn't believe the suicide. But because of the suicide, which was adjudicated by a German court 3 years afterwards, nobody's looked for Hans Himmler. Not the Nazi hunters, not the governments that would convict him of war crimes, and not the historians either.
I feel a little more prepared reading the book now that I've seen Man in the High Castle, so I'm familiar with the terms Obergruppenfuhrer and some of the other names they call them, which are scattered throughout the book, although I hated the ending of the show. Did you watch Man in the High Castle, by the way?
I saw the first season of it and then somehow lost track of it between the emergence of the first and second season, but I should probably go back and have a look at it.
It's pretty enjoyable until the last season, where Hollywood basically completely goes woke and ruins the entire series and makes you wish you'd never started it, so just be wary of that.
Okay.
However, Anytime someone starts a podcast like this, they have a lot of choices. I'm sure they're thinking, why should I care? And we're diverting a little bit from the typical content that I do because I'm fascinated by the fact that someone, and I'm glad you pointed out like George Patton, could just disappear. So you do a really good job starting off the story mentioning this very interesting interview you had with a surviving son named Jörg of Hans, and the details you extracted from that and how this started you down the rabbit hole of putting the pieces together. So I want to talk a little bit about, there's the weapons program, there's his place in the SS. There's also some interesting things that I learned in the first couple chapters. One, the purity test that started early. I didn't know that when you joined the SS, I knew you had to give up Christianity because there's a lot of people argue that, you know, all these guys were Christians and the SS was a Christian movement, but essentially part of this turn or this conversion of the SS was leaving that life behind and pledging faithfulness to Hitler. And then if you did it before Hitler took power, you got a special little badge that showed that you were one of the early ones, right? You were one of the first converts. So you talk about that, and give us some more ideas about how this seemingly loving family man turned into this man who designed Auschwitz and was one of Hitler's most trusted advisors.
So that's a good place to start. Kammler was born in 1901, so he actually was becoming a young man at the end of World War I, and we think that helped form him. His own father was an ardent anti-communist and an ideologue, and your listeners, I'm sure, remember that World War I was lost by Germany, but in a sudden, sort of almost embarrassing way. They anticipated victory. They thought they were on the cusp of victory, and all of a sudden, Germany surrenders. The Wehrmacht was blamed, and there became this stab in the back theory that the German army had betrayed the German people. And then Germany, and including Hans Kammler, lived through this period of darkness and deprivation under the Treaty of Versailles, and a great resentment grew. And that solidified Hans Kammler's anti-communism and his ideology. And as you suggested, even before Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, Hans Kammler joined the Nazi Party. And even before Hitler became president, Kammler joined the SS, the dreaded SS. So he was one of these ardent ideologues. And well before the war began, Hans Kammler wrote a treatise about how Germany could, in a practical way, this was basically a blueprint, expand its power, expand its reach, and begin to populate Eastern European countries, Poland, the Baltic states, Russia, Ukraine, Crimea. He envisioned, and he wrote this out in his treatise, Germany expanding that way, populating it with ethnic Germans, using slaves to do all the work, and in the process of using the slaves to build roads and in small German villages, towns, and even cities, consume the lives of 20 to 30 million slaves. So that's how hardcore he was. That's how early on he formed his ideology. He was not one of these late joiners of the movement. He was a leader, not a follower.
It's interesting. There's this seeming contradiction in the character of a man who could, I'm trying to remember some of the details from your interview with Jörg, who left behind written journals with specific notes and fatherly wisdom to his children, who had several of his own children die. I believe one of them was from, was it a hospital accident where the nurse left out, was it chloroform, and the baby inhaled gas? I mean, the irony of a baby dying from gas inhalation and her father being the man who masterminded the Zyklon B massacres of the Jews. How do you, you've written the book, I'm just reading it. How do you, and you not wanting to pull any, lay any hard punches on Jörg while he was essentially on his deathbed, how do you make sense of the divided mind of this man who could be one thing? And I talked to, it reminds me of when I interviewed Dinesh D'Souza, and he goes, these guys work in these concentration camps, and their wives have ancillary and service jobs, and they go home and they have dinner with their kids at the table. Then they wake up in the morning, put their boots on, and go kill their countrymen. Have we ever figured out how exactly that happens?
Well, that's one of the questions I pose in the book. What was it like when Hans Kammler went home and his wife said, "How was your day, dear?" And he'd spent the day murdering tens of thousands of people. Hans Kammler was the man who identified Auschwitz as the site for the major killing and slave labor camp. And then he designed and implemented the Holocaust, designing the standard concentration camps, but also the gas chambers and the ovens. And he configured things in a way that were were intended to make the killing as efficient as possible. He was that horrendous. But you're right. He married at the age of 29. He and his wife had 5 children. 2 of them died young. One of them died by inhalation of gas in that accident you described. And there is just a powerfully stark irony there that I couldn't find any hint of sympathy or empathy in that man for the men, women, and children that were sent to the gas chambers that he had installed, not just at Auschwitz, but at camps throughout the Nazi Reich. He was in charge of concentration camps everywhere in terms of building them out, designing them, and then turning them into killing machines and slave labor camps.
And you talked about how he was a brilliant young man. He was an engineer. He was a construction expert, and that I think in the book it mentions that you actually compare him to the Henry Ford of assembly line processes, material, scale, etc.
Early in the war, he was doing these benign but complicated building projects, buildings, roadways, test track for the police, communications networks. And he became known for his efficiency, ability to navigate the bureaucracy, get materials, standardize materials and processes in ways that led to efficiencies. And we see that duplicated in the Holocaust itself. There were to be 2 camps at Auschwitz. One was a killing camp. One was the slave labor camp. And the slave labor camp was originally going to be near the railroad tracks. The killing camp was going to be further away. Kammler flipped those 2 camps because he realized the people that were going to be gassed right away, the men, the infirm, the elderly, the women, the children, they couldn't as easily be transported that 1.5 miles to the killing camp. So he switched them and put the gas chambers as close to the ramps as possible, put them in the basement of a building with an elevator that went 1 floor up to the crematoria. So the dead bodies had to be moved over as little distance as possible. I mean, that's the way his mind worked. And he became recognized for that. And that's how he ended up in charge of all of Germany's secret weapons at the end of the war.
It is interesting to me, and this is just an assumption, that if you were in the mind of someone who was going to mass murder people, it would make sense you would hide that part of it 1.5 miles or 1 mile behind the work camp so that it was done in secret, in darkness. And once you become more brazen and just concerned about process and efficiency, you say, no. They go straight off the ramp and then straight down into the hole. And I can't wrap my mind around it, but you do a good job of documenting his descent into being focused on the most efficient killer possible. Talk to us about, go ahead, if you have a response to that.
Well, I was just going to say, well, that was one of the motivations, was to bring the Holocaust back to a generation of folks throughout the world who really aren't focused on it, who don't have much experience with it. I saw a poll recently that something like 60% of millennials don't know what the Holocaust is, or don't know what Auschwitz is, and 20% don't know what the Holocaust is. So that was one of the motivations in telling this story and really painting the picture of the Holocaust, which was difficult to talk about and difficult to read about, but I think necessary to read about.
I bought the book on Audible. I prefer to listen to it online in addition to the hard copy. And one of the things I mark anytime there's something I didn't know and had no idea about or is profound, I do a little bookmark. One of the ones I did was when you talk about the Nuremberg laws and how much of an offense and affront these are to humanity, and then you talk about how they got the people to go along with them. And you mentioned a comment, some of the effect of the Germans could only go as fast as the people would allow them to, and you call it incrementalism. And you talk about how if you're a German neighbor and someone 3 houses down gets booted out of their house, you would usually say, this is a horrible thing, I love my neighbors, what are you doing? But if you offer their property at 10% of market value and they get to keep all their possessions, then you don't have as hard of a time doing this. And you talk about the psychology of all the bystanders that allowed this to happen. And I thought there is an interesting parallel today when people are railing against millionaires and billionaires and paying their fair share, of being able to visualize how it could happen, that you could justify in your mind your neighbor being shipped off as long as you get something in return. You'll stay quiet. So is there more of that in the book, or was that the only bookmark I'm going to have for that type of attitude of appeasement among the public?
Well, there are more examples of that. And it was clear to me that the Holocaust, to accomplish the Holocaust, you needed tens of thousands of people, and you needed active participation from tens of thousands of people, and then you needed at least acquiescence from millions more. And that's what I tried to wrap my head around and tried to explain. And I think that's the way it was done. The human mind can rationalize things to an unbelievable degree, and especially when you're seeing your your own secondary benefits. And I talk about how, universities stopped admitting Jews, but that made it easier for the children of other people to get their kids into those same colleges they might not have gotten into. And then, Jews couldn't own businesses, but you could buy their businesses at fire sale prices. And I think some people even, you could manage to convince yourself you're doing your Jewish friend a favor by buying his business at the 10% of the book value. So
I read an interesting quote a while back in an article that said, we look at evil as conspiracy, but really it's just cooperation on a smaller scale. And I thought there's some truth in that. And so a lot here to cover. Let's give us some of the highlights. What are we going to learn about this man, and what difference does it make at this point? What role did he play? And then let's kind of wrap that up with the American conspiracy to keep this man alive and to milk secrets out of him, and the Fourth Reich and stuff that I haven't read about yet. So I'm kind of leaning on you to help us to titillate people into going out and buying the book.
Sure. I mean, I think the main feature of Hans Kammler in the first half of the war is his implementation of the Holocaust and the eagerness and enthusiasm with which he approached that project. Not just the killing, but the enslavement of the healthy Jewish people and other prisoners. There was this tension in the German hierarchy, and you can think about the prosecution of the war as one thing and the Holocaust as a second thing. And there's a little tension between those two goals. Hans Kammler sort of straddled the fence between those two different camps and managed to implement a slave labor regime that he had envisioned in the 1930s, but one that would house people under such conditions and work them under such conditions that they would eventually be killed. That was his sort of philosophy. The death of a slave was by him considered to be a victory. And there's a great quote in the book where he says, no matter the number of human victims, the work must be accomplished as quickly as possible. That was his attitude towards human life. And we wanted to paint that picture in part to show exactly what the Americans were dealing with when in the second half of the book, we talk about Hans Kammler ascending to control all of Germany's secret weapons, including not just the Messerschmitt jets and the nuclear research and radar and infrared, but the vengeance weapons, the German V1 and V2 rockets. Assuming, as we did, that Hans Kammler hadn't committed suicide, we had to explain what he had to trade with the Americans. And we make a very good case that I can tell you about in as much detail as you'd like about how Hans Kammler delivered the rocket team to the United States of America. The conventional wisdom is that we sort of stumbled upon the rocket team, but we show that Hans Kammler engineered their delivery to the Americans.
And I think in the book you mentioned, I was reading some notes that by the end of the war, there was no one more powerful in the regime or Reich than Hans Kammler, even more so than Hans Himmler, right? I mean, he was in the top 3 or 4 Nazi agents that are alive, correct?
That's exactly right. Obergruppenfuhrer is the highest commissioned rank in the SS. And there's an example we give at the end of the book where Himmler, at the very end of the war, Himmler's floundering a bit, I suppose. He's requesting something of Hans Kammler, and Hans Kammler just says no, which to me indicates that he had surpassed Heinrich Himmler, in the final days of the war. Himmler wants this massive airport, a Junkers 390, which has unbelievably long range, and he obviously wants it to get out of the country. And Kammler says, no, you can't have it. By that point, Kammler controlled all methods of transportation and all secret weapons.
So there's 2 things I want to talk about. I'm going to say them out loud because I'll forget. They just come and go. One is you talk about massive aircraft. I listened to a Victor Davis Hanson video about a year ago about World War II, talking about the futility of Hitler's war. And I like that you mentioned that when Hitler started declaring war, he made some major mistakes. His pact with Russia, invading Poland, thinking France wouldn't respond. Really fascinating stuff. Everyone go buy the book. It's great. But Victor Davis Hanson makes the argument that Hitler didn't really have a plan for what he was going to do about America, for the great Satan that was going to come and wipe him off the map. And in Victor Davis Hanson's words, hey, just build planes, build rockets, just do whatever it takes and we'll declare war on them. And he says that he just hadn't thought this through. You make the argument with the V2s that they were developing weapons that really gave them a shot. And with all their victories in Europe, there's no reason they had to believe that they couldn't pull off just about anything they wanted. That's point 1. We'll come back to that. Point 2 was that you mentioned the slavery and you mentioned the practices of the Nazis. I didn't know, again, this is a bookmark and Audible, that the Germans would go into countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Finland and Denmark, and if they found pure race children, they would just kidnap them and say, you know what, it's a lot better off for you to be part of the Reich, so we're going to separate you from your parents, you're going to come live with us. And you even hinted that Jörg could have been one of these children that was given to a pure family because Hans had lost some children. I thought, again, more parallels to today. Your children are unfit in your home, homeschooling, other things like that. It's our job to come in and make sure they're raised properly and under direct supervision of the new regime. So can you elaborate on each of those?
Of course, yeah. I'll do those in reverse order. I was shocked, as you were, to learn that the Germans were kidnapping children of Aryan appearance. So it tells me at least that the idea of creating an Aryan super race was a bit of a charade. They only had to be of Aryan appearance, and what they would do would be kidnap them, take them from the parents, oftentimes murder the parents, and this could be from any country within the German Reich at this point, and then adopt them to German ethnic families. It's one of the most hideous things I've ever heard of. I had never heard of it until I started doing the research of this. And you mentioned I got to sit down with Jörg Kammler, Hans Kammler's son, and what I would describe as sort of an eerie, almost surreal experience. And it was actually during that interview that it occurred to me for the first time that Jörg Kammler might well have been someone else's child. He might well have been one of these kidnapped children that was given over to the Kammler family because they had experienced the loss of two infants. And Jörg was the youngest child.
If I have the timing right, it was around Czechoslovakia, Poland invasion, like 38, 39, right? So Hans wouldn't have been in the country. He would have been out doing Nazi stuff.
Right. Hans was everywhere. In fact, he had his nickname was Staubwolk, which means dust cloud, which is sort of a vivid description of the way he moved from one place to another, always barking orders, commanding things. His inferiors, his subordinates, feared that they themselves would be shot and killed by Hans Kammler if they didn't perform. So that's what I'd say on the kidnapping of children. On your first point about what how Hitler viewed the Americans, I think the war got out of hand pretty quickly for Adolf Hitler. When he invaded Poland, he had been told by his generals that France and England would not honor their commitment to Poland and would not come to the aid of Poland, and they quickly did. So I think Hitler's real goal was always the invasion of Poland and then conquering the territories to the east of Poland. That's what he described as Germany's Lebensraum, the living space that he describes in detail in Mein Kampf and talked about forever after. His vision, which is reflected in Hans Kammler's treatise that I mentioned, his vision of an expansive territory to the east, which would be populated by ethnic Germans. It was some sort of glorious yet bizarre vision of a German empire. But a lot of times, in history, when one country conquers another, they don't replace the population. They conquer them, they turn them to their own means, but then they begin a new existence. Hitler, in contrast, envisioned conquering territories and replacing the population with ethnic Germans. He never, in my view, saw the Americans as an existential threat. Indeed, there's strong evidence to show that he envisioned the Americans being another one of the post-war superpowers, along with England. But he thought the Germans, would control Western, Central, and Eastern Europe and into parts of Asia, and the Americans would be friendly. Indeed, to the very end of the war, there's another tension here. Hans Kammler and his rocket teams are designing a missile, not just the V2, but something called the America rocket that was designed to reach the eastern seaboard of the United States. And they were contemplating using biological and chemical weapons in that. So the eastern seaboard, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., all subject to missile attacks from Germany. But at the same time, Hitler was still trying to negotiate a peace with the Western allies and get them off the war board so that he could make war exclusively with the Soviet Union. He even envisioned the Americans coming in to the war against the Russians, fighting alongside the Germans. That's how in the final months of the war. That's how sort of twisted his political radar got.
Well, 10 years ago, I might have said that's inconceivable, but as you read about the pockets of support for communism and fascism and certain types of rule, I mean, it might have been just as inconceivable to believe we'd ever join the Russians in war a couple years prior. So I guess in Hitler's mind, anything was possible. And I remember talking to my grandfather, who was in the Navy, and saying, you know what, at what point did you learn about Hitler's atrocities? And he'll look back and say, you know, it was a long time before it actually came out what was going on over there. So quick question on that. In the book, you talk about the development of the V-2 rocket, which I don't know much about, so I'd love for you to elaborate. But Hitler has a direct quote that if the rockets had been available in 1939, we'd never had this war in the first place. And he ended up putting Hans Himmler in charge of the rocket program. So I want to talk about Himmler's rise to power. Was it Kammler? I keep messing them all up.
It's Kammler. It's Kammler.
Yeah, frustrating. How, if that were true, then Hitler was essentially putting the most important program that Germany had in the hands of Kammler. Let's talk about his trust in him, the ascension of Kammler to that position, and then talk a little bit about the Fourth Reich and nuclear ascension and what the Americans, in your theory, what happened after the war was over.
Sure. Yeah, Kammler really had proved himself by the midpoint of the war as he was implementing the Holocaust, and he had done such spectacular work for the Germans up to that point, and he was the early Nazi. So, and he wore that special chevron. So he basically had a golden ticket when it came to being recognized by the Nazi hierarchy. And in October 1942, there was the first successful test flight of the V-2 rocket. This is a rocket the Germans had been working on since the early 1930s. And I really didn't know much about it when I started this project. I figured maybe this is an 8-foot, a 10-foot rocket or something like that. It was a 14-ton, 46-foot high, so it was about as high as a 5-story building. Wow. Supersonic rocket, and which meant it arrived before its auditory signature did. So you could be walking down the street of London and a city block would just blow up. It traveled at 3,600 miles an hour, rose to a height of 55 miles. It was a liquid-fueled rocket. Our scientists, the Western Allies, thought such a rocket couldn't even be built. They thought it was physically impossible to build such a rocket, but the Germans had it. They had a successful test flight in October 42, and Himmler and Kammler, this was their habit at the time, they'd see a project becoming successful, and they would identify the people in charge of it and offer them rank within the SS. And in doing that, they would co-opt control of the project. And that's what they did here. And Hans Kammler ended up in charge of not just the research, not just the development and the production, but actually in the battlefield firing these rockets. And they rained down terror on the citizens of London, Southampton, Antwerp, and that became a big part of Kammler's sort of legacy in the final couple years of the war. Deploying these rockets against the citizens of Great Britain.
There are questions in my notes here about the nuclear development of Hitler and how close they actually were to having weapons that would have assured that he won the war, or at least that everybody lost. Talk to us about Kammler's role in that and how close they were.
Sure. Yeah. Conventional history would say that Germany gave up its nuclear research with regard to a bomb very early in the war. Did a little bit of research looking at propulsion and power, nuclear power. Then history and the Americans really claim that the Germans failed to make progress in nuclear research based on two threads of argument that I found. And I think in the book, The Hidden Nazi, we really destroy those arguments. One are the farm hall transcripts. At the end of the war, most of the German nuclear scientists are collected and detained at Farm Hall in England, a detention facility. There are secret microphones everywhere, and a lot of their discussions are captured and recorded and then analyzed. And they said some things there that led the Americans to believe and the Brits to believe that they hadn't made progress on nuclear weapons. The problem with relying on that is that the Nazi scientists knew they were being recorded. They even had this pact among themselves, something called De les Arts, which means aversion. And it was an agreement among the Nazi scientists to not disclose the purposes of their research.
The spin, right?
Yeah, and not all the Nazi researchers were there. So relying on those transcripts, I think, is not a great idea. The second thread of information that was developed that we relied on to conclude they hadn't made progress was this ground team called ALSOS, ALSOS. This was a team of scientists that followed the Western Allies as we took back territory in Italy and France, and so forth. And they visited the nuclear research sites they could identify and analyze them. The problem relying on this sort of thread of research is that they didn't visit all the Nazi research sites. They only visited the sites that were going to be controlled by the Western Allies. So anything where Russia was going to control, that they never looked at. Most of the sites they visited had been pilfered. They'd either been evacuated by the Germans in advance of the coming army, or they were destroyed by Allied bombing or pilfered by Allied soldiers themselves who got there first and didn't know what they were dealing with. Sure. And the leader of the Alsos team said that there's more information and more sites here than any team of any reasonable size could digest. And yet they made this sweeping conclusion that Germany hadn't made any progress on nuclear weapons. So I think we do a very good job of destroying those conclusions. And then we cite a couple veins of research that Hans Kammler was overseeing that nobody really knew about, something called the Kammler think tank that was operating in Prague and near Prague. Although we can't really claim and we don't really prove that, Germany was on the threshold of figuring out the nuclear weapons puzzle.
Talk to us about the most important piece. Wrap it all together with his disappearance, alleged suicide, his surrender, what we had to gain not only by capturing him, but this secret deal with the devil where we had an incentive to apparently keep it secret for decades. Talk about the Fourth Reich. Talk about all these things at the end of the book that I haven't read yet, so I wish I had better questions for you, but just help us understand why this is so important for us to understand and why people should go out and buy the book.
Sure. One of the keys to understanding the whole puzzle is that everybody knew Germany was going to lose the war 12 months in advance, at least. Everyone knew there would be this mad scramble for German technology. Germany's rocket technology was vastly superior to ours. We end up with the German rocket scientists. Most people think we just stumbled upon them. And those German scientists got us on the moon, but also helped build our ICBM. And I think if we didn't get the German rocket team, the geopolitical landscape would look a lot different today than it does. I'm not sure we win the Cold War without the German rocket team. There's even an old Bob Hope joke that we got to the moon before the Russians did because our Nazi scientists were better than the Russians' Nazi scientists. So,
and it's been my historical understanding that a lot of those guys defected, that they couldn't tolerate anymore in Germany, or they got kicked out because they were Jews. But apparently this is a bit of a different narrative, right?
So some did come before the war started, including Albert Einstein. But I'm talking specifically now about 200 or 300 rocket team members who built the V2 rocket. Okay. That became our ICBM. They operated on the Baltic coast of Germany before the war and during the war, and then the Russians are coming. And there's this sequence of events we talk about in the book. In November 1944, this is 6 months before the war ends, America signs a contract with General Electric saying, General Electric, you build our V2 type missile. A month after that, Kammler's emissaries are meeting with representatives of the U.S. government and General Electric on neutral territory. A month after that, now January 1945, Kammler moves the rocket team from that Baltic northern coast as the Soviets are coming. He moves them to safety in central Germany. A month after that, there's the Yalta Conference, and it's determined that the place Kammler just moved the rocket team to is going to be in the Russian zone of occupation. That's what the Allies have agreed. So he moves them a second time on his own personal train, the Vengeance Express, to within a few days' march of the U.S. Army in Bavaria. So he hand delivers this rocket team, we think, and we call that the Kammler deal. He did that in order to rehabilitate himself, save his own life. The problem with that chain of logic, of course, is the suicide. Why would he go to such extraordinary means to save his life, defying Hitler's Nero decree, and then walk off into the woods and kill himself? The story hangs together, though, when we prove with government documents, U.S. government documents, that he faked his suicide. His suicide wasn't real. He actually surrendered to the U.S. Army at the end of the war, and we held him in captivity for at least 11 months. And then the Kammler deal makes a lot of sense.
I have some notes here about missing funds, the Kammler deal, and the CIC. Put that together for us.
Sure, you mentioned the Fourth Reich, and we sort of get into this without obviously the Fourth Reich has never emerged. But what's clear is that by 1943, this is about the midpoint of the war, Germany had already exported more gold than it possessed before the war, meaning it was offshoring gold. In 1944, there was a meeting in Strasbourg among German industrialists and German government leaders and army leaders, at which everyone was instructed to offshore not only their gold, but their technology in anticipation of a Fourth Reich. And this is a point where everyone knew Germany was going to lose the war. It makes sense that they would try to rise again. They lost World War I, yet they were, rose again for World War II. Now they're making provisions to rise yet again. And we came across a 1953 CIA report. So this is 8 years after the war. CIA contingents are down in South America. And this report rings like an alarm bell, TJ, where they're talking about German villages and enclaves, a German Chamber of Commerce in South America, Bavarian-style villages, and a structure that duplicates the German economy in South America, and the presence of lots of German technology and scientists in South America. And the CIA in 1953 was deathly afraid of the rise of the Fourth Reich. So we talk about that in The Hidden Nazi quite a bit.
I would encourage all of you to go out and go on Amazon or wherever great books are sold, buy The Hidden Nazi. Next time you want suspense, intrigue, and maybe, should I call them bad deeds of government? Espionage, because I'm still curious why America kept this a secret, but I'm sure I'll find out as I read through the book. Don't turn on Netflix, don't turn on Hulu, crack open The Hidden Nazi. Dean Reuter and his trifecta of authors have put together a very, very suspenseful book. And Dean, I thank you so much for your time. Best of luck, and thank you for helping us, encouraging everyone to go out and pick this up. It's a great work.
Really good to be with you. Thanks, TJ.
All right, thank you. Yeah, come here, babe. Oh, what you got? Hey, come here. Oh, look at the camera. Hey, what's that? Say, please subscribe.
Please subscribe.
Yay! Say bye-bye. Say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. That was fun. Good job.